Isaiah chapter 6, and it reads, In the year that the sovereign YishaYahu died, I saw Yahweh sitting on a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the Hekal, which is the temple. So let me go and show this name here in the concordance. Isaiah 6, YishaYahu, the strength of Yahweh. Here, Uzi would be my strength. Obviously, Yah is the beginning of the name Yahweh. So YishaYah would be my strength is Yahweh. Also interpreted at times as the strength of Yahweh. Now, this is very interesting because let me bring this name to the translator so that you guys can check it out. And well, I repeat, you can see it on YouTube if you are in TikTok at the moment, on our channel, The Way of Yahweh. So YishaYah is composed by the letters Ayin, Zayin, Yud, and Hey. So I hope you pay close attention here for a couple of things I'm going to say. Remember that in the book of Leviticus 16, we find the story about Yom Kippur, or how we celebrate Yom Kippur, and the fact that there had to be two male goats next to the ox and the ram, two male goats. One was sacrificed for Yahweh, and the other one was left alive and sent free to the desert, but carrying all the sins of the people to Azazel, who is blamed for all the sins of humanity, as we read in the book of Enoch. Azael was an angel who fell in the beginning of time, in the times of Noah. His name was Azael at first. So it was the same Ayin, the same Zayin, and then the Aleph Lamed of Mighty One, Azael. But when he fell from heaven to teach humanity evil, how to do more sin, which could be connected with the story of Prometheus being Halel Zeus and Samael Kronos. So here Azael became Azazel when Yahweh added a letter Zayin. The letter Zayin represents a sword. So Yahweh put a sword in between the Aleph and the Lamed to represent that Yahweh was cutting all power from him. He was no longer a representation of the Mighty One, because Azael means the strength of the Mighty One. YishaYah is my strength is Yah. If we were to say Azayah would be the strength of Yah, YishaYah, my strength is Yah. Azael, I repeat, was the angel that fell. Yahweh added a Zayin, which is a sword, to cut the power from him, the power of Mighty One, the power of Elohim. So he became Azazel, and that represents the false Messiah. Well, that is the false Messiah. He is the one that is going to come out of the bottomless pit and enter the image of the beast, and will force everybody to worship him. And if they don't, he will kill them for not getting the mark of the beast, which will be the action that everybody will have to take to show that they do worship that false Messiah. So, Azazel. But not only that, and this will connect with what we're going to read afterwards, or talk about afterwards, from the book of Ruth, because of the feast of Shavuot that is approaching. Because in the book of Ruth, we find a guy named Boaz. Not translated it correctly, but that's the name, Boaz. So he's the one that marries Ruth, and redeems her after another redeemer, the first redeemer, as we read in the book of Ruth, in the literal sense, he didn't want to do it because she was a Gentile. So that represents the first manifestation and the second manifestation, the first redeemer, the second redeemer. The second redeemer would be Boaz. Boaz is also the name of one of the two pillars at the entrance of the temple. Remember that the other pillar is Yakin, which represents Yahushua, he who would establish the kingdom, for Yakin means he will establish. And Boaz means quickly, or if we were to read it as Beos, with strength, because if we take the bet, which also works as with or in the Hebrew language, if we take it away, then we have strength, which, as you can see, is also found in the name of Azazel and is found in the name of Uzziah. So there's a positive regarding Uzziah, which would represent Boaz, the last, the other pillar, the king, while Yahushua, Yakin, he is the high priest. And the negative interpretation of Uzziah would be Azazel, who originally was Azael, pretty much the same name, but instead of Yah, El, for we know that Yah is Elohim. All right, so all of that so that we understand a couple of things I'm going to mention here. In the year that the sovereign Uzziah died, so in the sense of YishaYahu, because in this case, look how, and you see here, YishaYahu is not only Uzziah, but YishaYahu because it has the letter Vav. So has more of the name of Yahweh. So remember that the last, like I just said, comes as Boaz from the book of Ruth, comes as Boaz, as one of the two pillars of the temple, as he is promised in the book of Revelation. Yahushua said that he would give him the other pillar, the other column at the entrance of the temple, which is Boaz. So, as we just saw in Hebrew, it is directly connected to YishaYahu, the name, because of the meaning. Because here we have part of the name Boaz, and the other part is Yahu. And as we know, that would be Yahweh manifesting as what was represented by the person named Boaz. Okay, so remember that the last is coming also as a sovereign. Yahushua came as a priest. And remember that for everything to manifest, he has to die, as we see in Revelation 11. In fact, in Revelation 11, we see that he dies 3 days and a half later, he resurrects. In Revelation 12, right away, we see that he goes up to heaven and he receives the authority to expel Satan from heaven. And in this case, it wouldn't be Azazel, but the dragon Halel, the one that is being expelled from heaven with the third of the angels. Because remember that Azazel comes from the bottomless pit, comes up from the bottomless pit during the fifth trumpet, while the dragon comes down during or right before the seventh, no, right before the seventh trumpet, pretty much a day or hours before, according to what we have studied regarding the book of Revelation. Because remember that well, I said a day. I should have said like 7 days because I was only thinking of Shemini Atzeret. Shemini Atzeret will be when the harvest will happen, the seventh trumpet. But the persecution of the chosen few, which will end up with the death of the many, will happen at the beginning of Sukkot, which starts on the 15th of the seventh month. So there will be 7 days of persecution while the chosen few are hidden, as Yahushua told them to do, and then they will be gathered up. So, as we see here, in the year that the sovereign YishaYahu died, so yeah, that will be as the last dying, I saw Yahweh sitting on a throne. Now, look at this regarding what I was just mentioning about the book of Revelation. Like I already said, in Revelation 11, the two witnesses are killed. One of the two witnesses is the one I am referring to when talking about who Boaz represents. Then in chapter 12, he goes up to heaven and receives authority to take Satan out of heaven. And that's when Satan comes down and goes after the virgin, the woman, which is the congregation, to try and destroy her during the persecution that I was mentioning, which is actually what we always call the second Exodus. All right. So um in Revelation, 11, right after the two witnesses resurrect, it says, and they heard a loud voice from the heavens saying to them, come up here. And they went up into the heaven in a cloud, and their enemies saw them. And in that hour there came to be a great earthquake. And then, well, they go up right after verse 15. And the seventh messenger sounded, and there came to be loud voices in the heavens. So that is the seventh trumpet, right after the death and resurrection of the last, who is represented by Boaz, and in this chapter by YishaYahu. So then it says, saying, the reign of the world has become the reign of our sovereign and of his Messiah, and he shall reign forever and ever. So right after the death of the two witnesses, the resurrection, they go up, and that is when Yahweh finally reigns completely over everything. Obviously, he has control over everything, but this world was given into the hands of the enemy, even to the hands of vanity, till a time. And that time is coming. So now you see how, I repeat, the book of Revelation, chapter 11, is when the two witnesses die and resurrect. Right after they resurrect and go up, the seventh trumpet sounds, and then it says, the reign of the world has become the reign of our sovereign and of his Messiah, and he shall reign forever and ever. And we go back to YishaYahu, and he says, in the year that the sovereign YishaYahu died, I saw Yahweh sitting on a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the Heikal. So this represents when the two witnesses die, resurrect. In this case, YishaYahu representing the last dying, and therefore now Yahweh reigning, because the last already would have been sacrificed, and therefore there's nothing else coming afterwards because it's the last. So it says, I saw Yahweh sitting on a throne. So it refers to his kingdom, not the priesthood. High and lifted up, for he is the most high. And the train of his robe filled the Heikal. That represents his honor, his esteem. Remember that Yahushua compared esteem to the clothing of the king Shlomo, and compare his clothing to the lilies, that not even Shlomo, with all his esteem, was looking as good as the flowers that Yahweh created. So clothing represents esteem, and the clothing of the plants are the flowers. That is the esteem of the flower of the plant, their flowers. So high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the Heikal, the temple. Remember that the first represents the priesthood and represents the temple, for he said, destroy the temple and I will raise it up in 3 days. And he brought the favor and the presence of Yahweh to us, as we see, as I always say, in Exodus 33, when Moshe says, please show me your way. Yahushua is the way. So when Moshe said, show me your way, Yahweh said, I will give you favor and my presence will be with you. That's why Yahushua brought the favor and is the presence of Yahweh with us. And that's why he is Emmanuel, the mighty one with us. All right. But on the other hand, the last is the one who comes as king, and therefore is the throne of Yahweh and the Lamb that we see in Revelation. And since he is the throne, he is the Ark of the Covenant within the temple. That's why we see that Yahweh was sitting on the throne, but he was in the Heikal. So he was in the temple sitting on a throne. The throne in the temple is the Ark. So after the death of YishaYahu, who represents the last as Boaz, the strength of Yahweh, therefore YishaYahu, after that, Yahweh will reign forever, as we just read in Revelation 11. And if we were to read a little bit more, it says the reign of the world has become the reign of our sovereign and of his Messiah, and he shall reign forever and ever. We continue reading, and then he says, and the dwelling place of Elohim was open in the heavens, meaning the temple. And the ark of his covenant, meaning the throne, was seen in his dwelling place, because he resurrected and went up, and now he is set up as the throne for Yahweh to reign forever, as we are seeing also in Isaiah. And there came to be lightnings and voices and thunders and an earthquake and great hail. So, going back, I saw Yahweh sitting on a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the Hekal. So the temple was filled with his presence, with his honor. And if we were to continue, I already mentioned a bunch of things from Revelation 11. And I said how in Revelation 12 is when it is said that one of the two witnesses goes up, he receives authority and brings Satan down to the earth, and he persecutes the woman, trying to kill her. Then we get Revelation 13, which is a parenthesis pretty much in the story of Revelation, where we are told what will happen with the first beast, the second beast, and how they will prepare the image of the beast for Azazel, who will come up from the bottomless pit. Then Revelation 14 is the continuation of the harvest that started in Revelation 11, because in Revelation 11 we see the seventh trumpet sounding, as we just saw here, where it said in the verse 15, and the seventh messenger sounded. So in Revelation 11, the seventh messenger sounded. Thessalonians says that it is, well, in Corinthians, it says that it is during the seventh trumpet, the last trumpet, that the chosen few will be gathered. So when we get to Revelation 14, we see the chosen few being gathered during the harvest. They are the wheat, the many are the grapes of Revelation 14. All right, so when Revelation 14 is over, the harvest has been explained pretty much, and then the book of Revelation has to continue with the chronological order that was still following from the very beginning, after those parentheses that I mentioned in Revelation 12, 13, and 14 as the ending of Revelation 11 when the seventh trumpet sounded. So when we go to Revelation 15, which is when everything continues, it says, and I saw another angel, and I saw another sign in the heavens, great and marvelous, 7 messengers having the 7 last plagues. So since the last trumpet sounded in Revelation 11, that is the 7th trumpet, now the 7 plagues, the 7 last plagues have to happen. So that confirms that it is the continuity of the story of Revelation 11. So, and I saw another sign in the heaven, great and marvelous, 7 messengers having the great last plagues, the 7 last plagues, for the wrath of Yahweh was ended in them. And then we see that the chosen few are already over the firmament singing a song, the song of Moshe and the song of the Lamb. Remember that after the people of Israel went through the Sea of Reeds, known as the Red Sea, they sang a song in Exodus 15. Here in Revelation 15, the chosen few sing the song when they went through the firmament as a sea of glass. And then he says in verse 8, and the dwelling place was filled. So, and the temple, just like we saw in Revelation 11 at the end when the ark was seen. Now it says, and the dwelling place was filled with smoke from the steam. We are seeing in Isaiah that after everything happens that connects with what I just mentioned in Revelation 11 and 12, then it says that the robes filled the Hekal, the temple. We see the same thing mentioned here, but instead of mentioning robes as steam, smoke is mentioned as the steam, which is the same thing that happened during the inauguration of the temple during the time of Shlomo and during the inauguration of the Mishkan during the time of Moshe. So, and the dwelling place was filled with smoke from the steam of Elohim and from his power. And no one was able to enter the dwelling place until the 7 plagues of the 7 messengers were ended. So the temple was filled with his honor, his steam. And see how it mentions 2 things. the steam of Elohim, that is the last, and from his power, that is the first. The two pillars, Boaz and Yakin in this case, steam and power. That's why we can do all things through Mashiach who strengthens us, because he is the power, he is the arm. So, going back to Isaiah. In the year that the sovereign YishaYahu died, I saw Yahweh sitting on a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the Eikal. Above it stood seraphim. Seraphim is the plural of a saraf, which means a burning serpent. So these are a type of angel that look like serpents, but are burning in fire, or we could say, just like humans were formed from the dust, these angels were formed from fire. Pretty much, we could say on this earth, things were made from the earth, the soil, and the water, as we see in Genesis, at the beginning of creation, during the fifth and the sixth day, creatures from the water and then from the land. But in the heavens, they are made with fire and air. That's why they are spirits. It's spirits connected to air, and in this case, seraphim to fire. So above it stood seraphim. Each one had 6 wings. 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. So we see that this serpent, or these serpents, seraphim, have wings, and not only a couple, they have 6. So it is possible that Hillel, when he appeared through a serpent, which not necessarily was himself, but one sent by him, or could be himself, because we know that in the book of Hanok, it is said that the serpent was called Gadriel, the serpent that gave the fruit to Eve, or deceived her. So Gadriel starts with God, which is very interesting, as we see in Isaiah 65:11, that God is the false mighty one of fortune, which was worshipped by Israel when they left Yahweh to worship God, just like they do nowadays, sadly. So the same thing that happened back in the day is happening nowadays with the same entity, God, the mighty one of fortune. So it's interesting that it starts, like I said, Gadriel starts with God. So it could have been himself, or just an angel that had a connection with his name. So above it stood seraphim. Each one had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face. With 2 he covered his feet. And with 2 he flew. Right? So he needed to fly. But the other 4 wings were to cover himself from the presence of the Most High, which is interesting because it could be seen as them being very high up, powerful, mighty, pure angels, because they are made of fire. Fire purifies, yet still they are not as pure to be in front of Yahweh without covering themselves. And also showing that even fire would be consumed by the presence of Yahweh, the true consuming fire. So above it stood seraphim. Each one had 6 wings. I repeat, 6 wings. As you guys know, creation was made in 6 days. Then the seventh, he created rest. So each wing would represent a millennium, 1,000 years. Now, it's interesting that seraphim, like I said, are serpents of fire. Let me show it here. You see, here's the singular. It's saraf. Saraf. So we have it. A saraf. The shin represents fire. The resh is a head, and the pei is a mouth. So it's interesting that the last will be seen as a serpent, as evil, as a false prophet. Remember that serpents in Hebrew are connected to divination, and many confuse divination with prophecy, as if it was the same, because there are similarities, although divination comes from divinities or demons, while prophecy comes from the spirit of prophecy, which is the testimony of Mashiach. So the Shin represents the fire that covers, or that is the element from which these angels were created. Now, this is also a verb that means he burned or burning, depending on the conjugation, right? But this is a fire. And as I was saying, the last is one of the two witnesses. The two witnesses are said in Revelation 11 that from their mouths comes fire. So here we have a mouth on the head that spits fire. So the last will be seen as a saraf, as a serpent, just like when Moshe was told by Yahweh to throw his um, scepter on the floor, and he became a serpent. And also remember that when the people of Israel were sinning, murmuring against Moshe, Yahweh sent serpents because they were using their mouths to speak bad about their leader. Then the serpents bit them and put their poison in them, which represents the poison of sin that brings death. So Yahweh told Moshe to make a saraf. It's interesting that Yahweh said a saraf, not just a nachash. Nachash is serpent. Saraf is a burning serpent or fiery serpent. So when Yahweh told Moshe to make a saraf, Moshe understood that he had to make a nachash with brass, because brass in Hebrew is connected to serpents, and brass represents fire because you need fire to make it. So he made a nachash of brass, which was interpreted as a saraf. Why do I say all of that? Because when Yahushua came, he said that he had to be raised up on a tree, just like Moshe raised up a saraf or a serpent in the desert. And I repeat, here's the mouth of the head of the congregation that gives the fire, understanding, knowledge. So how interesting that when we were looking at these two names right here, and I mentioned that Azael in the negative can be seen as Prometheus. And what was the sin of Prometheus? That he gave fire to humans. But in the spiritual positive sense, the last gives the light, which is Yahushua, to humans. So he is seen as evil by those who control the world, the God of this world. All right, so I hope that was understood. As I was saying, above it stood seraphim. Each one had 6 wings. So, 6 wings. And interestingly enough, the name of that type of angel, has 3 letters. And the reason why, because obviously 6 is 3 times 2. And my point is that obviously they had 6 wings, but in pairs, right? So 3 pairs of wings. One to cover their face, and we have a head here. One pair to cover their feet, and a pair to fly. And depends how you want to see this, because this is the mouth, and the mouth obviously is used to preach, and to preach the good news is to have the zeal for preaching, which is in the book of Ephesians referred to as the sandals of the of what we need to wear for the spiritual fight, right? So this could be connected to preaching because it is the mouth, and therefore to the sandals, and therefore to the feet. So head and feet, each 2 pairs, and with the other one they flew. So going back, 6 wings, we could see that as the 6 millenniums of human history, separated in 3 pairs, because remember that it is written that first reigned death, then with the law reign the law and the prophets after Moshe. And then with Yahushua came the truth and the favor. So law and the prophets during 2 millenniums, the favor and the truth for the last 2 millenniums. So death reigned for a couple millenniums as well. Each era or age that was passing, then there was a change, if we could say, of administration in the second heaven. So that's why Yahweh appears as Yahweh Elohim during the first period, then as Yahweh Sabaoth during the second period, and then when he's preparing to manifest himself as the Word, as Mashiach, he appears as Dabar Yahweh, or the Word of Yahweh, to the prophets. So 6 wings, like I said, represent the 6 millenniums. 2 death reigned over the earth, and that's when the flood happened. That's also one of the reasons why water is connected in the negative to death, just as the rivers go to the sea, every life to Sheol. So then with Moshe came the law and the prophets, and therefore the accusation for 2 millennia. Then Yahushua came to give us the forgiveness from that accusation. But then he gave us 2,000 years for everybody to choose. So now with that in mind, those 6 millenniums, we have each one had 6 wings. With 2, he covered his face. How interesting that what would be the furthest that one can be from, well, Yahweh. In this case, I will say life. What the furthest that you can be from life is if you are dead, right? So death reigned over humanity during the first 2,000 years. A little bit more or less than 2,000 years. I actually just separated in 2000, 2000, 2000. However, the ages are a little bit more than 2000. So what was I saying that? Because it says with 2 he covered his face, just like through the first 2 millennia, Yahweh covered his face from the world, and that's why death reigned. Why did he cover his face? Because we, as Adam and Eve, sinned. So death entered, and therefore he had to cover his face, because if he doesn't cover his face, then there will be no death, there would be no free will. So he had to hide himself in order for free will to exist, and for atheists to be able to think, be allowed to think that he doesn't exist, right? So then he says, with 2, he covered his feet, right? How interesting, because the 2 second millennia were the law and the prophets, like the 2 feet. Here is just one face, right? Now, in Hebrew, it's panim, which is plural, because we have 2 sides in the face, which are mirrors, right, of each other. But it's just one face, one head. So just like death is one that reigned at the beginning, but then the 2 second 1,000 years would be the feet, because of the law and the prophets. But how interesting that within the law and the prophets, which is what the enemy used to accuse us, Yahweh had covered or hidden the salvation from that accusation, which was the coming of the Messiah. And he was hidden because the Pharisees themselves didn't recognize it and killed him, fulfilling the prophecies. So with 2, he covered his feet. So like saying, in the 2 millenniums where he sent the law and the prophets, he covered or hid the good news. Remember, I repeat, the feet are connected to the good news, because remember how beautiful are the feet of those who preach the good news of the kingdom. And then with 2, he flew. The 2 millennia, the last, are to get closer to Yahweh, to become like Malachim, and therefore get wings to fly, just like the congregation at the end gets the wings of the great eagle during the 7th trumpet, during the transformation, to go up to heaven and be with the Almighty. So, and with 2 he flew. So we see how these 6 wings represent the 6 millennium. And one cried to another and said, Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh is Yahweh of hosts. All the earth is filled with his steam. So one cried to another, for there were several seraphim. Set apart, set apart, set apart. Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. Why 3 times? Because he is he who was, who is, and who will be. Yahweh El Shaddai. 3 times Kadosh. Obviously, we could also see it as the Father, the Son, and the Ruach, or Father, Mother, and Son. Then he says, is Yahweh of hosts. So we see that here, because we're still in the time of the prophets, for we are reading Isaiah. Remember the law and the prophets? I said there was a different administration. That's why Yahweh changed from Yahweh Elohim to Yahweh Sabaoth, which is translated as Yahweh of hosts, as we see it here. All the earth is filled with his steam. What does scripture say? Well, like I already mentioned, the last brings the steam of Yahweh. And scripture also says that in the end, all the earth will be filled with the knowledge of Yahweh, like the sea is filled with water. So, before he was hidden, but now he will show himself to the world. When will that happen? When he finally reigns over his throne, once his throne is ready after the death and resurrection of the last. So all the earth is filled with his steam, which connects with Revelation 11, what we already read, regarding how it said here, the reign of this world has become the reign of our sovereign and of his Messiah, and he shall reign forever and ever. Then it says, and the posts of the door were shaken by the voice of him who cried out, and the house was filled with smoke. So we see here a confirmation of what I showed in Revelation 15 regarding the inauguration of the temple in heaven after the ascension of the last and the descent of the dragon. Remember Revelation 15 at the end? And the dwelling place, the temple, was filled with smoke from the steam of Yahweh and from his power. What does it say here? And the posts of the door were shaken. The posts. Let me see the verse 4. What word for posts? And the posts of the door. Ama. Like our sister Ama. Ama. Like that is a measure. Here, well, there are several things. These 2 letters form the word aim, which is mother. This as the word ma, which is what. Remember that word is connected to the second manifestation, the last. And this is the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. So we could see this as the first and the last. And well, we could see many other things there, but I'll continue. In this case it says amot because it's plural. So how interesting that we could see in amot, and hopefully you'll follow me here, letter by letter of the word amot. The first is the Messiah who would be nailed to a cross. Remember that in the pictographic and the Paleo Hebrew, the Tav is a cross because it's a sign, a seal. So the first letter. So you see how Amot starts with the first letter and ends with the last letter, Aleph and Tav. So there is a connection with first and last. Because we could also say that the ox comes as Mashiach during the 6th millennium as the Son of Man to seal those who come last. But when it comes to Mashiach, who is the Word, so first and most importantly, the first is the Mashiach who would be nailed to a cross. Hope that was understood. So let me go back to the English part. And he says, and one cried to another and said, set apart, set apart, set apart is Yahweh of hosts. All the earth is filled with his steam. And the posts of the door were shaken by the voice. Remember that? I'm sorry, hold on. All right. Yahushua is the word, the last is the voice. And the posts of the door were shaken by the voice of him who cried out, and the house was filled with smoke. Like we just saw in Revelation, and we see in the inauguration of the temple in the Mishkan. And the posts of the door were shaken by the voice of him who cried out, and the house was filled with smoke. And I said, woe to me, for I am undone. I'm always surprised by this reaction from the prophets, which shows the level, the spiritual level in which they were, because Yahweh made everything in a balance. So since our generation would be so bad in so many ways, and therefore it would be so dark spiritually, Yahweh, on the other hand, we have in the beginning how humanity was very, very pure in the sense of genetically, and they would live a lot longer and have pretty much in many ways, we could say perhaps better lives. But Yahweh made a balance so that we all go through what we need to go through in order to achieve the purpose for which we were sent. And we were born in the generation that we needed to be born in order to fulfill that. And many other things that we could say regarding that. But my point here is that humanity as a whole was growing from Adam till this point, as from a baby to being an old person. And the end of time would be the end of the life of that old person who happened to be humanity as a whole. So even though we were very innocent in the time of Adam, that innocency also created ignorance regarding the spiritual. So that's why we ended up worshiping things that were not Elohim, because we thought that they were Elohim because they looked mighty in comparison to humanity, but that was nothing in comparison to the true mighty one. So many times Yahweh would appear to a person through an angel, and the person would think that the angel was the Almighty. So they would get very scared because they knew that a man could not see the Most High and continue living. So they always thought that they were going to die. However, I find so funny in the good way that they always thought they were going to die. However, Yahweh was telling them to do something, to fulfill a mission. So how would they die if Yahweh is telling them to do something? It makes no sense. They should have known that Yahweh would give them life to fulfill that purpose. But their fear and their ignorance regarding the spiritual caused them those reactions, which are obviously normal. But I find like a reaction from a young kid in a sense, referring to humanity as a whole, even though we're talking about high, very important and spiritual prophets, right? In this case, Isaiah, one of the main ones. If one of the main ones. Let's just say that. So, and I said, "Woe to me, for I am undone." So he said, "This is over for me." And we're in chapter 6, so he's just starting the book, and he already thought he was going to die. Hold on, where was it? Here. Because I am a man of unclean lips. Now that has a lot of importance. First, once again, interestingly enough, as we read yesterday in Spanish in the book of YishaYahu, remember that YishaYahu said that he didn't know how to speak, for he was just a youth. And on the other hand, we have Moshe, who said he had problems to speak and that he shouldn't be the one chosen to go and do that. Now we have Isaiah saying something similar. In this case, he's not saying that he doesn't know how to. He's saying that he has uh, a dirty mouth, in the sense that they have been saying words or titles or names that they should not have been saying, as the world nowadays. And that's why it also connects with our time. When Yahweh chooses the last, remember that Yahushua, his name is Yahweh saves. YishaYahu is he whom Yahweh saves. So it is like first and last. Remember that the prophets themselves represent the last. But the prophets, all of them, prophesied about the first, because the spirit of prophecy, according to Revelation 19, is the testimony of Mashiach. And who is Mashiach? The spirit of truth. So truth and prophecy, first and last, both are the Ruach, Yahweh, in two separated vessels, as priest and king. So here Isaiah is saying, oh, I'm going to die because my mouth is dirty. And that refers to language, bad language, of course. Safa would be lips. Let me go to verse 5. And there is, here it is, Safataim. I'll show it here so that you guys can see that it is connected to language, because there, just like in English, there are two words at least for a language. Language is connected to the word. Well, in English you cannot notice it, but language comes from tongue, while idiom is connected to this right here, which would be the lips. So there are two ways in which one can know a language: in a very superficial way, which is connected to the lips, or in a very deep way, which is connected to the tongue, which is inside, and it goes deep. So um, Hebrew is the Lashon HaKodesh, is the deepest, most profound language that there is. Um, However, the Hebrew that they speak nowadays in Israel is not a language. We could say is an idiom, is a safa, right? So you see lip, but we have here language, speech, and I am using another word than language, because like I said, language is the one connected to the tongue. Woe to me, for I am undone, because I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the sovereign Yahweh of hosts. So he thinks that he's going to die because he just saw Yahweh. And he doesn't refer to his unclean actions or deeds. He is more worried about the words that he and his people have been speaking. As in, I repeat, not only bad words, but false names, false Elohim, like worshiping Baal instead of Yahweh, worshiping God instead of Yahweh, as we read in Isaiah 65. And I will show it just in case somebody hearing is new or something. Isaiah 65, 65:11. It says, but you are those who forsake Yahweh, who forget my set apart mountain, who prepare a table for God. So you see it right there. Now, sadly, since they write it with a letter A, many say, oh, that's not the same. Of course it is the same. It is pronounced exactly the same. And if you are to go to the Hebrew, then you will see that it doesn't have a vowel. God is just the Gimel and the Dalet, which is pretty much the G and the D. So the vowel is uh is hidden, we could say, as it was in the original languages. So there you can see the word God. So they left Yahweh to worship God, and that's why they are a people of unclean lips. And remember what Yahweh says in the prophets, Hosea, Zephaniah, for instance, Hosea 2:17. Let me just read it here. I'll wash your mouth out with soap. Get rid of all the dirty, false, mighty one names or false Elohim, not so much as a whisper of those names again. Not so much as a whisper of those names again. All right? Hosea 2:17. I will wash your mouth out with soap, just like some parents would do with their children, right? When they would say bad words, curse words. That's what Yahweh will do with those who are worshiping God and the Lord. For remember that the Lord in Hebrew is Baal, just like it is written as well that they would worship Baal instead of Yahweh. 2:17. How interesting, you see, because that is a very weird translation, the one I just read. Look at this one. For I will, which is the most common one. For I will remove the names of the Baals, meaning the names of the lords, from her mouth, and they shall be remembered by name no more. And if you go to, as you guys know, let me show in the concordance the word Baal, which is a name of Satan. You see here, Baal, you click it, and then you have that it means Lord. So as I was showing the other day, and they forsook Yahweh. Look, if I click here, it's going to take me to the word that was originally there, and it is in fact the name of the Most High, Yahweh. So in the King James, they switched the name Yahweh and they wrote the Lord. And what does this verse say? And they forsook Yahweh, which they changed with the Lord, and served Baal, which if you click means the Lord. So in the translation itself, they did that exact same thing. They took away Yahweh and replaced it with Baal, which in English is Lord. Reason why we don't use those words. And it is something that was happening from the very beginning of time, or from the very beginning of knowing the names. The enemy would change those names to remain in power. So, and I said, woe to me, just like I mentioned, Yahweh first would reign through the Elohim. That's why Yahweh Elohim. And then he would reign through Sabaoth. That's why Yahweh Sabaoth. So he would change a title according to the angels he was using to manifest in this world. And that's why the enemy changes the name of Yahweh for his own in order for people to worship him instead of Yahweh. And therefore he remains in power over the world. And that's why there has been an apostasy over the past 2,000 years, which are 40 jubilees, because during the 40 years in the desert, they were going around because they worshiped the golden calf right after the lamb was sacrificed. So, and I said, woe to me, for I am undone, because I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the sovereign Yahweh of hosts. And one of the seraphim flew to me, having in his hand, so they had hands as well, not just wings. And one of the seraphim, and it's interesting that his hands and not like an animal, right? Which would have feet. In this case, a hen, which makes it more anthropomorphic in a way like we see in Genesis when the serpent was talking to Eve, and then Yahweh took every extremity from its body and it became just what we know now as a serpent. And one of the seraphim flew to me, having in his hand a live coal, which he had taken with the tongues from the slaughter place. Now, this is very interesting as well because the same thing happened with Moshe, but we don't read that in the book of Genesis or Exodus. We read it in the book of Yashar, which is confirmed by the Torah. In the book of Yashar, we read that Moshe, when he was a child, he took the crown from Pharaoh and put it on his own head. So the wise men interpreted that that meant that he was going to take the power from him eventually, so that they had to kill him. However, Yahweh sent an angel, and the angel told them that they shouldn't kill a child over that instead they should test him, and they should put in front of him a precious stone and a live coal, so that if he would go and grab the stone, they would understand that he had knowledge of what he was doing when he took the crown. But if he took the coal, then that meant that he had no knowledge, so they could spare his life. So when they did that, Moshe, as a child, was going to grab the precious stone, meaning then he would be killed. But the angel, through the Spirit, held his hand and moved it towards the live coal, and he grabbed it and put it in his mouth, and that's why he got burnt, and that's why he had issues speaking. Reason why when Yahweh came to him, he said, "But I have issues with my um speaking abilities," right? So here we see something similar. And one of the seraphim flew to me, having in his hand a live coal which he had taken with the tongs from the slaughter place. The slaughter place, the altar. So the fire from there is a heavenly fire that purifies, just like the sacrifice of Mashiach purifies us. So with that coal, the mouth of YishaYahu would be purified, just like in a way Moshe as a child was being purified to be ready to speak for Yahweh on this earth when his time came. And he touched my mouth with it and said, "See, this has touched your lips. Your crookedness is taken away and your sin is covered." That is amazing. Why? A lot of people, mainly Christians, when we tell them the importance of the name of the Messiah and the name of the Father, they don't give that much importance to it. They reject it many times. They laugh at it. They even blaspheme because they feel very comfortable where they are spiritually, if we could call it spiritually. They are very comfortable in their churches, in their groups, whatever it may be, in their doctrines. So it's funny how we see here evidence that purification of the whole being would come through the purification of the mouth. For we see here that it says, "And he touched my mouth with it and said, See, this has touched your lips. Your crookedness is taken away and your sin is covered." Meaning, just like when we confess the name of Yahushua, his spirit comes to us to make us righteous. Your crookedness is taken away and your sin is covered, and we are forgiven and therefore receive salvation through the confession, because righteousness comes through belief in one's heart, but salvation comes through the confession with your mouth, as we read in Romans 10:10. So we see evidence of that when YishaYahu got his lips, his language, his words purified, then his crookedness was taken away and his sin was covered. The fact that he mentions the covering of sin, that connects with Yom Kippur, the day of covering. You see how it says here, Vehatatecha, which is, and your sin, says, tekupar, will be covered. Now you see here, kupar is the same root as kippur. So we could also read this as the first and second manifestation, what each would do, or how everything would manifest through each one. Your crookedness is taken away during the first manifestation. During Pesach, Yahushua died, just like sin is the crookedness, and sin is what enslaves us. So we were freed from slavery in Egypt after the lamb was sacrificed, to represent that after Yahushua was sacrificed, we will be freed from sin, from our crookedness. And then the last comes to die on Yom Kippur, the day of covering. So after the first and last both have died and resurrected, your crookedness is taken away and your sin is covered. But all of that through the confession of the name of the Messiah. Verse 8. And I heard the voice of Yahweh saying, whom do I send, and who would go for us? I always find this funny as well because YishaYahu was the only human around. So we see here how Yahweh, in a way, doesn't force anybody to do anything. You need to want it. You need to uh, agree. You need to be willing. And a lot of people are not, either because of fear, because of lack of trust, because of lack of faith, whatever it may be. Yahweh, for instance, and this is a big one, Yahweh knew that we needed to come through this world of death in order to receive the reward for the next world, of the next world. So he knew it, but he didn't put us in a world of death because that would be unjust. So we needed to take that step. It had to be our choice. And that's what happened. We chose to eat, and that's why we enter this reality. So we cannot blame him because it was our choice. Now we have here that he says that YishaYahu is in heaven. He has only mentioned Malachim, Seraphim in this case, and Yahweh. And Yahweh is like, oh, whom do I send? Right? And I says, like, I guess me. Of course, he was ready and willing. I'm just saying it's funny that Yahweh would ask instead of just telling YishaYahu, hey, go. I'm sending you. No, he first asks, whom do I send? And who would go for us? Us, as in Yahweh and Yahushua, Elohim. And I said, as in the last, Hineni, here I am, send me, Shelacheni. Hineni, Shelacheni. And he said, go, and you shall say to this people. Now, understand this, because people tend to think of prophets as, whoa, he's going to tell us the future, and it's going to be a good future. He's going to tell us if we're going to have a house, a car, and a wife, a good job, right? That's what people expect from prophets. And that's very beautiful if it is the case, and obviously, mainly if it comes from Yahweh. And I mean good news, not just the material stuff, just good news. But we see that most of the time in the scriptures, Yahweh would send prophets to tell them that they were doing wrong. And people don't like hearing that. So they always go against the prophet. And I say that because people tend to think that things should be different in their generation. Even more now when they have a wrong doctrine regarding the Messiah, and therefore think that because of grace, as they would say, everything will be fine for sure for everybody, as in a rapture, for instance, which is not going to happen as they expected. So I repeat, and he said, go, and you shall say to this people, hearing you hear, but do not understand, and seeing you see, but do not know. Remember that this was manifested in the time of Yahushua very plainly. He would tell them everything directly and nobody would get it because they worshipped idols. So they were like the idols they worship, who have ears but cannot hear, therefore do not understand. They have eyes but cannot see. And that's why Yahushua would many times say, he who has ears to hear, let him hear. And I'm sure everybody there was saying, I got ears. What are you talking about? Just still didn't get it. So the same exact thing would happen in the end times, and is happening at the moment. People are the same or even worse because every generation gets worse with time. So our generation is the worst of all generations in human history. And he said, Go, and you shall say to this people, hearing you hear, but do not understand. So imagine, like, really, like, getting in the shoes of somebody who has a lot of pride, a lot of ego, a person who thinks he or she knows everything. If you tell he or she, yeah, you were listening, but you don't understand anything I'm saying, right? They would get angry because they would feel like you're telling them that they are dumb. But that's not the case. Go and well, uh, it's a dumb decision not to accept Yahushua, of course, but it's because of a bunch of other spiritual things, not just lack of intelligence in the sense of the intelligence that this world talks about when they use that word, or lack of brain, right? Because remember that true intelligence, according to scriptures, is to flee from evil, flee from sin. That's true intelligence, not to do evil. And therefore, this world is not intelligent at all because it promotes evil constantly. So, verse 9, and he said, Go, and you shall say to this people, hearing you hear, but do not understand, and seeing you see, but do not know. Make the heart of this people fat, and their ears heavy, and shut their eyes, lest they see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and understand with their heart, and shall turn and be healed. This is amazing. Yahweh was prophesying what manifested with Yahushua, the fact that he would come to the earth in a human form and would speak directly to his people, and most of his people would reject him and even kill him. Make the heart of this people fat, and their ears heavy, and shut their eyes, lest they see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and understand with their heart, and shall turn and be healed. They weren't supposed to be healed because they didn't deserve it according to their actions. That's why they were deaf when the word manifested. Then I said, Yahweh, until when? Right? So Isaiah is worried because he's like, so until when are they going to be deaf and blind? And he answered, until the cities are laid waste and without inhabitant, and the houses are without a man, and the land is laid waste, a ruin. So till the very end of time. In the time of YishaYahu, when Babel would enter and destroy everything, but in the general time, human history as a whole, it refers to our time. And Yahweh has removed men far away, and the forsaken places be many in the midst of the land. But still, there is a tenth part in it. There is a tenth part in it. So it's like the tithe, right? The tenth part. And it shall again be for a burning, like a terebinth tree and like an oak, whose stump remains when it's cut down. So the people are going to be cut down, but those are the many, while though the stump that remains are the few, the remnant. And that is the tithe that the last brings to Yahweh through Mashiach, the bikurim, the first fruits. And it shall be again for a burning, because they are gold, and they are tested through the fire, like a terebinth tree and like an oak, for they are righteous, whose stump remains when it is cut down. The set apart seed is its stump, the chosen few, the set apart seed, those who confess the name of Yahushua, which is the word of Yahweh. And as we know, the word of Yahweh is the seed, and he is the set apart one. So his name is the set apart seed. The chosen few who confess his name at that are the stump that remains, the remnant. And that's how the chapter ends.